a question here that asks about whether this, our conversation this evening is biased towards a Western perspective on social cohesion. And given, Paul, earlier today, you talked about Te Reti. And so what unique perspectives does New Zealand have here, given our bicultural foundation, and what could we do that might be slightly different to some other people when it comes to rebuilding?
Well, I think that's ultimately the New Zealand challenge, isn't it? How do we build a multicultural society on a bicultural underpinnings? And we haven't really had that discussion completely yet, and it's not been a particularly open discussion either. So it is the fundamental challenge. But getting back to the root of the question, democracy as we know it is effectively a Western invention. And clearly we've seen that countries outside outside the Western world, as you might define it, have struggled to accept the model of democracy as we see it. But having said that, if you go into most Indigenous societies, they have their own ways of maintaining social cohesion, and they come to the same basic points. How do you actually decide who has authority and how the rules are set and what happens to people that break the rules? And secondly, how do you have a discourse where you get agreement within the society on what to do? Now, that scales at different levels, from small Indigenous societies to the rather distinctive large Indigenous society that we have in New Zealand. But the principles are still the same, that cohesive in a society can either be imposed by an autocracy, which means you lose agency, or you have agency as individuals, in which case you need to both have ways of defining the rules of that society and the way in which decisions are made. So while the specifics are obviously different in different kinds of societies, the fundamental evolutionary dynamics are the same. Namely, societies don't work if there's not an agreement on how rules are set and behaviours are tolerated.
As I said, I was deeply embarrassed by how we constructed social cohesion back in 2006 for the cabinet paper, and my major embarrassment was around the lack of Te Tiriti. In my most recent writing, I've actually used Tahu Kukatai and Aramarata's framework in terms of things like manaakitanga and whakawhanaungatanga as principles or as values that can be brought across to help us maintain, restore, improve social cohesion in New Zealand. So I think there are some conversations and some acknowledgements that we need to make in terms of acknowledging tangata whenua and some of the values that they're able to provide for the rest of us. And of course, what I'm always struck by, as I'm sure many of us are, is by the generosity of spirit of tangata whenua when it comes to these discussions and the willingness to contribute to them. And so I think it's an invitation that we should take up and we should continue to explore. We're on a journey and we've probably got a long way to go, but it is one of the things that I think has stood us in good stead in recent decades, and it's a strength of this country.
I'd agree with that. And I mean, we're seeing an increasing number of Maori scholars such as Charles Royale starting to address how that journey might continue and what are the necessary steps along that journey.
So I guess this is a really good place to reflect on sort of some of the key areas we've talked about. And I think, Te Tiriti is an area that is certainly a strength in terms of rebuilding and strengthening cohesion and making us more resilient. We've already talked about deliberative democracy and the role that plays in rebuilding this. And I wonder, given we've got a couple of minutes left, what are some of the other priority areas where we could focus on as we look forward, and in terms of how we do build some resilience in this space.
I'm going to jump in before Sir Peter here. I was at the Diversity Awards last night here in Auckland, and I handed out the overall prize, which actually went to the city mission. And one of the things, there were a couple of things that occurred to me. One was, inside that room, we had people who were addressing all of the issues we've discussed today in the context of organizations and workplaces. And so I would really like us to profile some of the best practice that is already occurring at community and organizational level. The second thing is, we really haven't talked about the private sector, the private business sector here. And you know, most of us work in that private sector. They need to be partners in any of this. There are some that are really good at what we've been talking about in the context of their particular organization. And what struck me last night was that the award winners weren't simply doing it in terms of their particular firm or organization. They were doing it with communities, with the people that were that worked in their organization, but they saw them as people who came from families, who came from communities. And we've really got to bring the private sector into these conversations, because I think they have a critical role to play.
I would take a slightly, I don't disagree with Paul, I just would add a dimension we've not talked about, which is, in New Zealand, we tend to be very short-term in our thinking. We don't take a long-term view. Well, that's not true. Maori take a long-term view, but as a society, we don't take a very long-term view. And yet the society we face now has a lot of fundamental challenges, from climate change to technology, to the future of our economy, to the nature of our political economy, to the dramatic changes in our demography and social structures that Paul knows far more about than I do. And all of those are coming down the pike at a speed, at an unprecedented speed. And I think if we don't start to have honest conversations, we've just brushed over the word territory, and yet different people in New Zealand have different understandings of what that word means. And if we don't actually have a consensus on what we're trying to achieve, we will continue to have division. I mean, if the same word is used to mean different things by different people, you can't have a discussion. And so I think we need to focus on every modality and every forum on trying to get to a discussion of ideas rather than a discussion of people.